This is a great group. Everybody's very upbeat and spry for such a late night. That was a lot of fun. I hope everybody had a good time. I'm Elizabeth Sykorowski, class of 1998. Thank you very much. And I am very pleased to introduce Professor Stuart Madnick. A personal note, prior to coming to Sloan, my job right before Sloan was as a cybersecurity reporter. And I was covering break-ins to the Defense Department and NASA. I have some incredible stories from the early 90s, if anybody wants to hear them. And I would read about this Professor Stu Madnick. And he was one of the early writers and pioneers in this field, knew much more about it than almost anyone else in the world. And now, of course, it's something that we, all companies and all industries think about. So it was very much of a pleasure and a privilege to come to Sloan and learn at the school where he teaches. He is the John Norris McGuire Professor of Information Technology at the Sloan School. He is also a Professor of Engineering Systems in the School of Engineering. And you are the founding director of the Cybersecurity program at MIT Sloan, formerly known as IC3. Stu has done some incredible work around the organizational elements of secure companies, and he can talk to you about that today, I'm sure. And perhaps a little known fact, he operates a 14th century Langley Castle Hotel in England, which is pretty cool. You will see that he's wearing his red jacket. That is because he is a graduate of this wonderful school or wonderful university, and you've been on the faculty since 1972. And I give you Stuart Madnick.
Thank you. One of the few things I learned from taking the finance classes here was to amortize the price of this jacket. So I felt I had to find excuses to wear it to kind of figure out how to make it get my worthwhile. So it's a pleasure to meet so many of you today. It's a beautiful day outside, so I hate to take you away from that enjoyment. But I want to share with you some of the things we're working on. This whole issue of cybersecurity, if it wasn't so tragic in some sense, it would be hilarious. So I'll tell you a few stories as we go. And I want to kind of make this as interactive as possible. And in the process, this is MIT, it's time for a quiz. So let me ask a show of hands if I can. How many of you know if your organization has experienced a cyber attack? Oh, quite a few there. The reason why I asked that question in that particular way is I've been known to say that there are only two kinds of organizations anymore in the world. Those that know they've been cyber attacked and those that don't yet know they've been cyber attacked. And the reason I say that is, according to various studies done, the average cyber attack has been going on for over 200 days before it's detected. And in the Asia-Pacific region, the number is closer to 400 days. So those who didn't raise your hand yet, maybe next time we'll talk again and see where things stand. Now, what I wanted to do, I kind of described this session as kind of popular myths. Now, once again, it doesn't mean that all of you have experienced them, but these are things that I hear when I talk to executives, and I want to kind of clarify some points for you. So this is just a quick list of the things I'll talk about, kind of my agenda for the session. So many of you, before I even go for the list here, I want to kind of put in a context. All of you here are alumni from the Sloan School. All of you either have or have at one time been involved in management. And the question is, cybersecurity sounds kind of like a kind of techie subject. You know, should managers really care about it? Or should top executives care about it? And you may remember not too many months back, there was the attack on Equifax. And there was a headline that said the chief information officer and security officer should be out, which obviously is of concern to them, but more onerously is the CEO should go too. And of course, that happened about 2 weeks later. So this does have some concern for people in upper management. The other one I want to ask you about, how many of you have heard about WannaCry? Many of you have. It turns out this was on May 12th, and I was just at the end of my teaching my class when one of the students came in. And this is a student who had worked in Spain at Telefonica. And he said he just had gotten an email that's from one of his colleagues there. My Spanish is terrible. So he translated this that said, urgent, turn your laptop off. Because in fact, Telefonica was hit with a ransomware attack. It blocked 80% of all their computers. So what they basically did, they told everybody to just go home. and they shut the company down that day. So in that particular case, over 300,000 computers in over 100 countries were attacked all within hours. So this is the kinds of things that are going on. Now, let me step back away to my I just did that kind of make sure anybody said, well, maybe I'm not interested. This maybe gets your interest level up a teeny bit. Let's talk about these issues here. Most of us probably first started to hear about or learn about cyber attacks having to do with stolen credit cards. You know, Target, you picked the company and they've been attacked. And of course, you know, that's of concern to you. But in reality, particularly in the US, most banks say that if you're liable only for $50. And as far as I know, I haven't seen any bank yet even to collect that $50. So for most of us, say, well, that's annoying, and you may have to go get new credit cards issued, which is always a pain, but it doesn't seem like a big deal. And so if that's kind of all you thought was going on, I want to kind of add it up a little bit. I don't know, how many of you have heard of ransomware before? Okay. So we're going to talk a bit more about ransomware. One of the most amusing cases was when the first ransomware attacks I heard about was a ransomware attack to the Renham Police Department in Massachusetts. So the police department's computer was being held for ransom. Supposedly they called the FBI in, and this, by the way, is something I don't think ever was reported in the Boston Globe. Everything's in the Boston Globe, but not everything, I guess. Is that they asked the FBI, what should we do? The FBI, played around for us. This is pretty tightly locked up. Is there anything useful on these computers? Yeah, well, they're only asking $500. Probably not a bad idea to pay up. In case, so ransomware is, and that's of course what happened to Telefonica and hundreds of other organizations. But it's not just things like that. How many of you are familiar with SWIFT? Okay, SWIFT, as you know, now they're very careful. It's not a money transfer system. It's a messaging system. But basically, they are responsible for anywhere from $6 to $9 trillion of money rotating around the world. And of course, they, or at least they, in the indirect sense, I won't go for the nuances of what happened, were involved in an attack on the Bank of Bangladesh. The attackers almost got away with $1 billion. They only got away with a mere 80 million. But if they had a spell checker, they might have got a built-in, because there was a typographical error in one of the messages. So it's like the old, was it one of Shakespeare's things about for lack of a nail, the shoe was lost. Well, for lack of a spell checker, $1 billion was lost. Something for them to think about in the future. But it's not just about money. Now, money definitely gets people's attention. There are all kinds of other issues, particularly going on in the last couple of years about issues of attacks on election systems, attack on public opinion. It really has gone way beyond kind of the issue of just being a matter of credit cards being stolen. But the thing I'm going to maybe focus on a bit more today is, of course, it could be your property or your life. That gets to be quite significant. One of the things we're doing, I'll explain more about this in a few minutes in my talk, we're looking at what we call the connection between cyber and physical events. So for example, I don't know how many of you know about the Turkish pipeline explosion or the German steel mill attack. You may have heard stories now and then in news about attacks on the US electric grid. Now, these are things that kind of affect things. When I talk to executives, they say, well, I'm not in the electric business. I say, you're a bank. If you don't have electricity for 3 or 4 months, do you think that might make a difference? Okay. And these are the kind of things we're very concerned about, because it's an issue that these affect our day-to-day lives in very serious ways. And once again, I don't get a commission for that, but there's a fascinating book by Ted Koppel. I just want to read the dust jacket. It says that a cyber attack is not only possible, but likely, and the United States is shockingly unprepared. I'll talk more about that later on. So I'm not pushing the book, but just illustrating the fact that I'm not the only lunatic out here kind of raising these as possible concerns. In fact, one of the things I do want to raise issue on this topic, though, it's kind of fascinating. But anybody here from the government before I go and offend them too badly? So if you think about this, imagine, for example, you're running a bank, a manufacturing company, or even the Sloan School of Management, if you will, and some enemy aircraft are flying overhead, dropping bombs on your facilities. You would expect the US Air Force, or whatever country you're in, to go up there and shoot those people down. If they're doing the exact same damage through a cyber attack, guess what? Good luck, you're largely on your own. That's a key issue I'm going to talk more about later on. is that this is something that's so new, most governments haven't really thought well how to deal with it. Now, once again, I'm doing a very broad, sweeping things. There's a lot going on, but when you actually dig into it, you'll find the deficiencies are quite serious. So that's kind of my first level. One of the things I want you to do next time you're talking to your local mayor or governor, you might ask them, what plan do you have if we lose electricity in my city or state for 3 or 4 weeks or so? What is your plan? I actually asked, no one answered. I actually had one person, they talked to the mayor's office. They said they had a plan. I said, well, can we see it? No, it's top secret. Okay, I hope somebody knows what's in that plan. Okay, so let's move on. Next thing. Now, many of you have been following the press, and those of you who are entrepreneurial may realize this. There are cybersecurity startups all over the place. In fact, I have recently had some visitors from Israel. It turns out if you throw a rock, you'll hit a cybersecurity startup company. They're all over the place, all over the world and all over the United States. So the obvious question would be, isn't the problem being solved? Isn't the problem going away? And the good news is, you see this line here, a lot of good things are going on, a lot of new technologies are coming out, a lot of things that are making us more and more secure. That's the good news. The bad news is that the bad guys are getting even badder faster. This is just a headline in the Washington Post, hackers are getting better. And this gap is growing. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, and once again, hopefully I'll cover more of that in my talk today. But one of the things that's going on, it turns out, is that it is fascinating. One of our research we do, we're looking at managerial issues. And one of them has to do with information sharing. How well do we kind of coordinate with each other to defend ourselves? It turns out the bad guys are much, much better at that. They share information. In fact, they take pride in spreading the news. And that's how they get their ego boost, if you will. So there's a tremendous amount going on, what's often referred to as the dark web. And that's where all the trading goes off. So for example, once upon a time, you have this picture of the high school kid in his basement at home, hacking into something or other. You don't have to, basically, you barely know how to spell cybersecurity. In fact, you don't even know how to spell cybersecurity to become a cyber hacker. Almost everything you need to do to set up a really comprehensive cyber attack is available for sale, often $14.99, and that's dollars and cents, if you will. I'll give you some examples of that later on. We're doing it. In fact, the tools are pretty good because some of the tools, like the tools that we used on WannaCry, in fact, were tools developed by NASA. With your tax dollars, I don't know how many millions or billions were spent, and then they were all seized and resold on the internet for $14.95. So the ability for the quote bad guys to get badder faster, it keeps growing. Doesn't mean well, I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit. Okay. Next thing, okay. The obvious next question well, isn't this kind of just a technology problem? I used to joke that and tell me if anybody had this experience, not too long ago, 10, 15 or so years ago, cybersecurity was a chore largely assigned to the junior assistant programmer trainee, whose job was to take the latest floppy disk from Microsoft and go desktop to desktop installing the latest patches. That was, somewhere one notch above janitorial services in most companies. Okay, so the issue here, isn't it kind of just a technology problem? Okay, well, it turns out, yes, indeed, a lot of work has gone into it, all those cybersecurity startups I talked about. We have great groups of researchers, both here at MIT, my colleagues, and elsewhere, building all kinds of new cryptographic codes and fancy firewalls and all great stuff. But someone mentioned, I'd forgotten about this, it turns out. I actually had co-authored a book called Computer Security in 1979. Now, for someone who can't remember what he had for breakfast, remembering what you did in 1979 was a bit of a feat. So someone actually called that to my attention. And I went back and I actually looked over some of the chapters, and one of the chapters kind of concluded with a comment something like, if you only look at the technical issues of security, you're missing half the problem. And I mentioned that at a meeting not too long ago with some executives, and one guy raised his hand and said, Madnick, you're totally wrong. That number is way too low. And numbers I've seen are 70 to 80%. Another conference actually said it's closer to 90%. What they said basically was attackers are not dumb. They go to the low-hanging fruit, the weakest link. As the hardware and software technologies get better and better, more and more the focus goes to what the weakest link is, which is us. Okay, so the effects of attacking us or through us is what's going on more and more. And so that's the reason why, as kind of was mentioned in the introduction, I appreciate, we've taken a kind of interesting view. If you go around, I haven't done an actual numerical count, and you look at all of the cybersecurity researchers going on in the world, both in universities and in companies, somewhere probably 70, 80, maybe 90% of them are building better hardware and software. So we felt, well, gee whiz, that the old joke you heard about the guy in the street wandering around saying, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my keys. Well, where'd you lose your keys? I lost them over there. So why are you here? Well, the light is better over here. Well, in a similar vein, there's a lot of focus on the areas. We feel that's great. There's a lot of great people. Let's go look at the areas that have not been looked at, the areas that in some sense have been overlooked. So that's why we're focused, particularly here at Sloan. Once again, we do dabble in technologies, and some technologies have to cross over between both. But our special focus, I'll explain more about, is on the managerial, organizational, and strategic aspects of cybersecurity, which is why I thought it might be of interest to many of you here. Okay, next, this is the fun part. Okay, yes, we're the weak link. Well, isn't there a simple solution? How many of you ever got something kind of like this? This is almost verbatim. Hello, I am a Nigerian prince. I have just inherited $100 million. I want to share my good fortune. I was surfing the internet and came across your name, and you seem like a really good person. I would like to give you $1 million. All you have to do is pay the taxes or something. Has anybody ever seen anything like that? Okay. So you say, oh, God. It turns out, by the way, I actually talked to people who are even more expert than I am. This is all often called phishing. And some of them, the English is all cobbled up, how they read. I was told this is done deliberately. What they're trying to do is save time and energy by figuring out who are the really good fish to land. And they figure if you fall for this, they're worth spending the time on you. So this is their admissions form, if you will. They want the person with the lowest GMAT. And this is how they kind of filter them through. So maybe they don't have the Sloan School email list on their Now the question is, I call these the mass phishing, and they've gotten better. I think the diabolical ones are the one that says, we're here to help you. We're your IT department, and we understand attacks are going on. And we think maybe your password's been compromised. You have to go through the following procedure to change your password. That's kind of diabolical. They think they get you in kind of a lull to think, oh, they're kind of here to defend me. Of course, these are the bad guys doing it. So they're getting better and better. So in general, these I call well-crafted, generic, have hit rates anywhere between, depends on how they're crafted, 10 to 18%. But that's not what I want to focus in on. How many of you know what spear phishing is? I see a few hands. And once again, maybe we'll go into various different kinds of names. Spear phishing is very targeted email. The classic example of the email would be David getting an email from the dean of the Sloan School referring to the fact they had a good time last night together at the Pops or whatever it was. So doing something that kind of clearly registrates that you guys know each other very well. And said, gee whiz, we're having a key event going on for the alumni on Sunday, but it turns out we have to give a deposit to the caterer. Could you make sure a check is delivered or emailed, preferably, to this address by tomorrow? Typically it's to the CFO and for money to go to a law firm or something. Now, this is where it's getting really, really clever. You say, well, maybe you've heard Madnick's talk, you're a little bit suspicious. So what you do is, at the bottom of the email, it said, oh, by the way, I would have called you about this, but I'm actually at a meeting. I'm attending Madnick's talk, for example. Okay? And so you say, well, I'll call the dean's office. You call the dean's office, the secretary answered the phone, can I talk to the dean? Oh, no, he's at Madnick's talk right now, and was told not to be interrupted. Now what do? You get the message from the CEO to do something. It's not something that's unusual. You're a big company, multi-billion-dollar company. You have all kinds of deals that are kind of very important to get closed. You have lawyers involved and so on. You're told to send $50,000, which is in many ways pocket change. It looks like it's coming from the dean or the president or CEO. You tried to confirm it independently, weren't able to do so. And it said it must go out today. What do? I'll let you ponder that. But according to most data, it's about 70% and going up. And now, just so you don't feel bad about it, this has happened to the White House, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Barclays Bank, so you're in good company. So the quality. Now, how do they do this? Well, it turns out this first thing is fantastic. Millennials are great. Everything you want to know about them is on their Facebook page. So you could create a custom crafted thing that talks about Aunt Sally. I hope she's getting weather. I understand she was in the hospital last week. It is fantastic. And of course, assuming they've broken into your system, they've got all the correspondence between you and the executive. So they can, it takes more time, but once again, they're looking for $50,000, $100,000. Hey, how much is a couple hours of time worth nowadays? Even at outrageous Sloan School rates, that's not a bad deal. Okay. Now, let me get my breath. So this is all depressing. I will turn it around in a minute. So don't jump out the bridge yet. Okay. But people often ask me now, well, what are some best practices? Now, this is where I'd like to express a little more gloom and doom. I say there are no best practices. All there are poor practices and less poor practices. Okay. And by the way, it's not just me. There was a conference last year where the roughly says, we suggest not using the term best practice, just call it current practice or just practice sharing. Because even the best isn't all that great. Okay? And I often say, if the NSA, the Pentagon, Israeli Defense Forces can be broken into, why do you think you're so much smarter? So it just kind of put things in perspective here. And maybe we are smarter, but just something to caution you about. So what I want to do now, though, is say a few things that I think are going to be helpful. And that's going to be the second half of my talk. By the way, don't be shy about asking me questions as I go. I will allow, hopefully, time for Q&A at the end. How many of you are familiar with the White House cybersecurity framework? Anybody here? Okay. Trump, well, of course, it's been around for a while. It was set up during the Obama administration. Trump sent a directive out, I forgot how much, maybe now 2 months ago, that every federal agency must comply. It's not clear what comply means, but comply with it. So let me tell you a little bit of what it's about, because I think it is, for those who didn't raise your hand, it's a fascinating thing to look about, whether it be for your own personal interest or, more importantly, for your company. And it really has 5 key areas I want to mention here. The first one called identify, which I'm not sure that's really when you actually read how they describe it, I'm not sure identify is the right word for it. It basically says develop an organizational understanding of cyber risk, because most people are not even aware of what could happen to them, whether it be blowing up their steel mill or stealing their credit cards or whatever it might be. So first thing is, if you're not aware that you've got a problem, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time and energy addressing the problem. So that's kind of obvious, but amazingly poorly done in most organizations. Let me give you an example of that. I don't know if any of you from a manufacturing company? 1 or 2 hands. I don't know how it's set up, but it's very common, you'll see in factories. And the entrance to the factory is a sign over the door. Something like 520 days since last industrial accident. Okay? When's the last time you saw a data center with a sign over the door? 50 milliseconds since last cyber attack. And that's about the right number, probably. The average organization has 30,000 attempted cyber attacks a day. Okay. Fortunately, they're being, many of them are the easy ones that are being, but you have no idea, most people are not totally unaware of how much of a risk is around them. So that's kind of the first step. Okay. The second one is where most time and energy does go in most companies, and the number has ratcheted up significantly over the last 5 or 6 years. And that's putting in better firewalls, putting in dual authentication, all the kinds of things that I'm assuming many of you have done or have seen being done in your companies or in your day-to-day life. So it doesn't mean there's more to be done, but this is where I think most of the energy is gone. Not enough, I think, in the first category. But then the next 3 are important. I said before, often hundreds of days can pass while you're under a cyber. Now, admittedly, if a cyber attack, shuts you down, you kind of know right away. But the cyber attack that's taking every single email between Dave and the dean and going through and culling them over a period of weeks or months, you have no way of knowing it's going on. So a lot of these are called reconnaissance cyber attacks, or they could be draining things out, your intellectual property, your credit card numbers, whatever it is. So a lot of these things are not obvious to you. In fact, I don't have the actual number for this either, but intuitively or anecdotally, I would say half or more of those cyber attacks that do get discovered are not discovered by the company being attacked. They get a call from the FBI. We shut this guy down, and we found a lot of credit cards that look like yours on the machine. Do you think maybe you were attacked? And that's usually why most people discover it, not because they notice it themselves. So having a way, imagine you run a bank. At 5 o'clock or 4:30 when you close down, one of the tellers goes out the door with a wheelbarrow full of money. How many weeks will go by before someone notices that? Okay. Well, the trouble is in cyberland, it goes on forever, or almost forever. So that's the first thing, detection. Respond. What do you do? We have a table talk exercise we do, because this is moving up in the rung. The exercise basically is we saw a video of a CNN reporter say, oh, we just discovered that Sloan School was attacked, and all of the action learning information and all the IP and all the information that companies had shared with MIT have been stolen. We're now here at the door of the dean of the Sloan School to interview him to see what he's doing about it. And we kind of put the microphone in front of the chairman of boards of companies, CEOs. It's an awkward situation. Most of them haven't thought about, A, what am I going to do, and what am I going to say? And this is a real wake-up call. We did this with a group called the Community of Chairmen at the World Economic Forum. So the idea of, do you have a response plan? Or does your governor or mayor have a response plan when you lose all power in your city or state? And then finally, okay, what are you going to do in the future? That after this is all over, how do you get back to something that resembles normality or better? So for those who haven't looked at it, once again, the full report is probably more than you want to read, but there's like 20, 30-page summaries that are quite informative, very helpful, and definitely, I think, are valuable for those who aren't aware of it. Now, and I asked the question earlier, how many of you are using it in their organization? So, but unfortunately, it's not enough. In fact, I actually have one other colleague at MIT whose name I won't mention, but one of the faculty members who called the NIST framework the work of the devil, or was it work of Satan? I can't quite remember which. And the reason for that, though, of course, is that good news is for organizations that haven't done anything at all, it definitely kind of gives you a wake-up call. The bad news is for many, it becomes a lower upper bound. You say, well, there's 10 things I should do. It says, I've done something that vaguely looks like those 10 things, so I can go back to sleep again. And the argument is this is the starting point, not the ending point for most organizations. Unfortunately, some organizations that even get onto the track assume that once they can mentally assume they've done it all, that everything is over, and that's just the starting point. I won't go for the issue here. As I said here, they said, oh, one more thing I should mention. David reminded me this morning, there was a very nice piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was about last week, on our work of how companies can create a cyber-safe company culture at work. For those who are interested, I brought a few handout copies of that as well. But it's basically, what are things you can do, getting back to the identify and overall, how do you get people in the organization? Remember my comment about the sign over the door of the factory versus the sign over the door of the data center? What are the things you can do to kind of get it to be front of mind of people, which it isn't in many organizations today? Okay, so far so good. It's been pretty depressing, I hope. So let me talk a little bit about what we're doing here at MIT to try to address these issues. So what is MIT doing? Now, it was briefly mentioned here, we have this entity we first called the Interdisciplinary Consortium for Improving Critical Infrastructure. So I had to make sure I read it because it took me about 2 months to get it straight. But if you look at the initials are IC, oh, I see. That's kind of clever. Or we call it IC cubed. Okay, I often joke that at Harvard it'd be a square, but here we can deal with cubes. So that was the name we started with. But for people who kind of felt that still was a mouth filler, we've abbreviated it. We now call it Cybersecurity at MIT Sloan. We actually use both names because the first one actually has a certain following in the world, so we kind of keep it around from memory. So as I mentioned before, I'll go through this quickly. We've already kind of said this earlier. Prevention of a cyber attacks on regular systems, we're not so good at that. They go on and on all the time. How many people knew that 213 hotels were broken into 3 weeks ago? Okay. That doesn't make the front page news anymore. Oh, well, boring, boring, boring. I mean, yet another one, okay. So in some sense, we realize it's still going on, but looking at what we call the cyber physical infrastructure or critical infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, has had much less attention. It's ramping up, but ramping up very slowly. So our feeling is we want to make sure, not exclusively, but we want to make sure that's an important part of our agenda, if you will. But as I mentioned before, the most important thing we want to address the managerial and organizational aspects of it. Now, this slide is too busy and too small print. In the handout, you have another one, which is also incredibly small and hard to read, but you can get all that stuff on our website. What I want to do is we have about 22 projects going on. And almost all these projects, I can't take credit for the idea. I've been meeting with people like yourselves and say, what's bothering you in your company? And that's a fascinating idea. Maybe we can do something about it. Some cases we can't, but in many cases we think we can. And so we've launched quite a few projects. We could spend the next 8 hours or so going through all of them. I'm not convinced that's exactly the best use of your time. So I'm going to just pick 3 as a sampling. So you have a little flavor where you going beyond kind of the top level slides. To be sure I'm doing okay. So the first I want to talk about, 3 I'm going to go through here. One is called the House of Security. Now, for those of you who have dabbled in or done a little bit of work in looking at cybersecurity, they often refer to the CIA. That is not the Central Intelligence Agency, or maybe it's somewhat related, but it is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which are kind of the 3 things people most worry about, typically. We say that's all very important, but think of them as the roof of a house. The roof of a house doesn't kind of stay up there all by itself. Something has to hold it up. And we say you have to have things like technology resources, financial resources, a business strategy, you have to have policies and procedures, and you have to have a security culture. Without those things here, that roof ain't going to stay up very long. So we've developed an instrument for measuring these things. Once again, I'm going to go briefly through it. It's kind of fascinating because, once again, one of the great things about Sloan and MIT, we collaborate across all kinds of areas. Like we do a lot of work with organizational behavior, a lot of work with system dynamics groups, a lot of work with marketing groups, as well as with people in computer science and political science at MIT. So this came up out of conversations with some of our behavioral people, said, maybe you should do is try to monitor and measure people's perceptions about security. Now, it turns out my undergraduate degree is in engineering. I said, perceptions? Well, why don't you measure the real thing? And the answer is twofold. First, there's a lot of things for which it isn't easy to measure the real thing. But as one executive very wisely told me, perceptions are actually more important than reality. Perceptions affect your behavior. And if you don't understand people's perceptions, you'll never understand their behavior. With that inspiration, we developed this method here, but basically it's the instrument we ask people to do to evaluate about their company. Once again, very cleverly constructed. We don't ask about you because we know you are perfect. We ask you about your colleagues, like how well do you think your colleagues understand cyber risk to your organization? Now, how do you measure that? How do you know that? But you have an intuition about that. So we get your intuition about these things across these, we call 8 dimensions. So this is kind of what the results look like. In this case here, it's kind of a spider diagram. What's interesting, this happened to be 3 different companies. We've actually done many more companies, but this is kind of an early slide. I use this. And what you talk about is not, we ask you 3 questions, or 2 questions actually. We say, where do you think your organization currently is? And where do you think your organization should be? Now, of course, you might say, well, it should be perfect. Well, most people have a certain notion of diminishing returns. So they kind of say, well, we're at a 5 now on a 7, or a 4 now on a 7-point scale. If we can get up to 6, I think that we'd be doing pretty good. And we measure, we call the gap. How big is the gap between where you think you should be and where you think you are right now? I'm being very brief about it. So this shows you the gap. The things you notice here, of course, is that there are some places where the gap is not 0, but not too far off. And other places like culture where the gap is quite huge. So this can get a way to kind of say, what is the sense of what's going on in your organization? Here's a quick quiz question. We also do this both across companies, seen here, but also do it within a company. We break things up by different functions, marketing, finance, so on, and different levels. Top executives, middle-level managers, and kind of the professional staff. Of those 3, which of those, I think, have the largest gap, the biggest difference between where they think they should be and where they are? So let's go by show of hands. Top executives. How many think top executives? How many think middle managers? How many think the professionals? By the way, everybody's got to vote, by the way. This is, you turn in an empty final exam, you don't get a grade. Okay. I normally spend more time kind of motivating why and so, but it turns out it's top executive. And we've done this in about a dozen companies. The shape isn't always exactly the same. But it is interesting. It also is why top execs are now getting more and more on board. So in any case, this is just one example of the kind of research we do. And we have lots of research papers on that one. I have 2 more to cover, and I've got just about, I guess, 15, 20 minutes to do that, and leave a little bit of room for talk. Okay, the next one I'm going to do is fun. We call it cyber safety. Now, this is where, once again, I do travel around, as many of you do. I've been a visiting professor at probably about, I think, 12, 15 universities in recent years. And people often ask me questions like, how does MIT differ from other universities? I often say one thing I find about MIT compared to many other universities I visited is we have very permeable walls. A lot of organizations, I joke about, anybody here from Harvard, by the way? I often joke, Harvard Business School isn't even the same city as Harvard University. Not that that's deliberate necessarily or not. But my point is the idea of flowing from business school to the rest of the university, or even within the business school. In many organizations, this is my narrow focus. And we draw across the board. So this is some work we actually developed in conjunction with Professor Nancy Levson, who's in aeronautical engineering at MIT. Because for many years, she was working on how to prevent airline accidents, something I'm sure you all appreciate, I'm sure. And she's developed a methodology for analyzing it. And we thought about it for a while and say, well, a cyber attack is different because it's not accidental, it's deliberate. But a lot of the things that you look for to prevent accidents are things you might be looking for to prevent cyber attacks. So we said, can we take what she's developed over 10 or 20 years of research and adapt it? And we call that cyber safety. She has a fascinating story. I'll give you a real quick version of it because it really motivated me a lot. How many of you remember the NASA Challenger explosion? Well, pretty much everybody remembers where they were that day and so on. If you read the newspaper reports and such, it will tell you that the space shuttle was launched on a particular chilly Florida day. There are these things called O-rings, which I don't know much about, but they're kind of a rubbery-like material. And apparently if it's too cold, they become brittle. And become brittle, they can fracture, little leaks or cracks could form, gas could escape, and things explode. Nancy Levson was a part of a commission put up to kind of investigate the aftermath. And of course, they pretty well came to the same conclusion. But in their report, they also pointed out that an accident, not necessarily that particular accident, but an accident of that type was inevitable due to organizational changes at NASA that had taken place over the previous 3 years. Previously, the safety division was an autonomous division. As part of reorganizations, it became part of the operations division that had contractual obligation for a certain number of launches within certain time windows. Although not done deliberately, the risk tolerance, the attitudes and approaches to safety slowly changed over that 3 year. They concluded that the situation NASA was in had a 1 chance in 100 of an accident taking place. This was launch number 81. They were doing better than average. So the reason I'm saying that here is people often look at what I call the end result, whether it be the Bangladesh bank being broken into, or Target being ripped off, or Challenger space shuttle exploding, and don't consider the fact that there were lots of managerial decisions, or in some cases indecisions, that really precipitated or at least greatly facilitated that from happening. And we think that's very important. As I said, I'm going to skip over this slide. Why we look at industrial control systems and factories, because they can. We have one student whose project is, how big a boom can you make? And we've made several booms. The idea is not just things being shut down, being stolen, things can explode. Damage can be done, lives can be lost. I'll skip over that. But in Nancy Levson's approach, she uses a hierarchical process model. Remember, this is engineering. Most of you have an engineering background, so we probably won't ski you out too much. The first thing is top-down. Now, I use a simple analogy for that. Imagine we're trying to secure, in a physical sense, MIT. Let's say MIT has got 10,000 doors. And let's say in the ideal situation, at night, all 10,000 doors should be locked. But that takes a lot of time and energy. It'd be nice to know which of those 10,000 doors are really most important. You'll try to lock all of them, but there's certain ones you want to really make sure are locked. So the idea here is really understanding what it is you're really trying to prevent. If you focus on that, that can really narrow things down. Doesn't mean you should ignore everything else, but it makes you a better chance of focusing. So it's based upon that notion of looking top down. It's based upon what's called a process model. It basically says everything, whether this is a bank or a manufacturing company, you've got processes. They can be mechanical processes. One of our sponsors is Mars, and they came up with M&Ms, and so it's a machine that makes M&Ms. Or it can be a manual process. It can be a bank teller, giving out money. So there's a process. But then there's always intended to be some kind of control mechanism that oversees that process to make sure it's functioning correctly. And there are feedback loops. There's the oversight checking how the process is going, and then there's things it can do to tweak the process or check the process, if you will. But the key idea here, this is hierarchical. So this controller I just described also is a process, in which case there's a controller for the controller, and on and on and up. Okay, I'll give you an example in a minute, illustrate this. Once again, if we have time later, I'll come back to it, but it's kind of a fun story. We studied the Marushi Shire sewage spillage camp. It sounds like something you would have seen in Lord of the Rings. But imagine you're on the lawn of the Grand Hyatt and 50,000 gallons of sewage, raw sewage, is being pumped onto the main lawn. It may get your attention. So it's a fascinating story of how that all happened, okay? Particularly if you're on your way to Marushi Shire next week. Okay, so in any case, so let me skip over this one and go this one here. Some of you may remember, it goes back a few more years, the TJX. It was probably the first really large, highly visible cyber attack. It turns out not much has been learned since then, but I won't go through all the details of what wasn't learned since then. But this is what, and once again, this slide is much too small for you to see, but this is what the hierarchical structure looks like. Down here at the bottom of the laser pointer here, I guess. There it is. Okay. This is the credit card processing operation of TJX. But you see it goes on and on and on. What I'm going to jump to real quickly for a second is way up here, state legislature. What in the world? By the way, the break-in that took place at TJX was actually done through a Marshalls. And TJX is the parent company of TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Home Goods, maybe a few others. But the break-in took place through a Marshalls store in a shopping mall in Florida. Florida seems like a dangerous place to go. So things happen there, it seems like. So what does a shopping mall break-in in Florida have to do with state legislature? Well, it turns out, and I'll say more about it in a minute, there is a thing called PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It's a recommendation for retail stores how to manage and secure credit card information. It turns out that if TJX headquarters, you may know, is just off the Mass Pike here in Framingham, in Massachusetts. If TJX's headquarters was in Nevada, Nevada state legislature mandated that all retail operations must, so it became not a recommendation, it became a regulation in Nevada, not in Massachusetts. So they were not required to be PCI DSS compliant, and it turns out they weren't. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only reason why they were broken into, but I'm just saying all these players contribute to the situation that ends up happening down the road a ways. Okay. Now, in the analysis that we do, and I'm going to do it once again, not too slow but not too fast, usually involves 4 steps at each level of this hierarchy. You say, well, what is it that this level is supposed to do? So it should make sure that the credit card data is encrypted. It should make sure that everything is PCI DSS compliant. That's what it should do. What is the reality? The reality, TJX was not in compliant. So it's like saying you should have sprinklers in every room, and we don't have sprinklers here, or the sprinklers don't work, as the case may be. So you know what it should do, but it isn't. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons I'll elaborate on the next slide, and then what can you do about it? So there's a process you go through at each level saying what should you be doing, what could go wrong, and what do you do about it? So I'm going to slow down now. Only a few more slides to go, so hopefully we'll have a chance to have some questions. So one of the things that Professor Levson talks about, and we've seen this in our experiences, and this is why I think it's challenging for all of us. Your risks, whether it be accident risks or cyber risks, grow enormously when you're going through a change because you don't have experience, whether it be you're putting in new kinds of technology in your company, you're adapting new procedures, you've just acquired another company. Whenever there's events of change, in the case of NASA, they changed the organizational structure. Whenever that happens, problems can occur. So there are a couple of changes that we looked at in our analysis. The first one, this is good news and bad news. TJX was one of the first retail organizations to go into Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi, once upon a time, was new, which, by the way, is why we wired up every single desk in E51 to the desk, and the next year decided no one ever needs to use it anymore. So just, it costs a lot of money, I was told. But anyways, another story. So things kind of change abruptly. So they were one of the first. That way you don't have to worry about moving wiring and down. It's a great idea, except they were not fully cognizant of what the risks were of putting in Wi-Fi. So they were one of the first to do that. Second thing, there is an issue, my colleagues call it recall bias. That is, if it hasn't happened to you before, the plausible assumption, it never will happen to you. I was told by a colleague of mine that 50% of all home burglar alarm systems are sold within 2 weeks after the house was broken into. So other people may be broken into, oh, they're dumb, they leave doors open, they're not very smart, we're much smarter, it will not happen to us. So there's kind of, if it hasn't happened to you before, there's a tendency to write it off. But the last one here is kind of fun. And this is sometimes called the confirmation trap. So this is but what was nice about the TJX case, one of the challenges I mentioned at the beginning is information sharing. If you're a company and you've been broken into, do you want that to be in the front page of the Wall Street Journal? Now, there are some legal requirements in certain cases, but if it's a steel mill that burns down, it was an accident. In fact, this is something I'm going to spread some rumors now. How many airlines have been shut down for a day or two in the last year? About 5 of them so far, due to power problems or circuit breakers. I don't know what's going on. But in any case, I'm just saying they had the same circuit breakers 5 years ago and they weren't breaking down as often. I don't know. So in any case, so the odds are you're not anxious to reveal that something is going wrong. What's nice about the TJX case, because it was so big, it had legal actions involved, a lot of things were disclosed in court documents, including hundreds of thousands of emails. So there's lots of things you don't necessarily get a chance to know about in many of the other cases. So this is an email that went from the CIO of TJX to his staff. In general, what the email is saying is, well, we know, of course, that we're not PCI DSS compliant. And we also know that will take quite a bit of work to put in the necessary procedures and such. It's getting to be close to Christmas time. Things are very busy here. Money's been kind of tight this year. Don't you all agree with me that it would be fine to postpone this for another year? This may shock you. None of his staff seemed to object to that idea. Okay. So a lot of time we kind of convince ourselves everything is fine, we can continue to ignore things. So I'm just sharing with you. The last thing I want to do here is, it turns out, as I mentioned, it did get a lot of investigation, both the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, US, and also the Canadian equivalent, because they had a lot of operations in Canada, investigated. They came out with a detailed report. What you notice is we did our analysis. We came up with a number of recommendations that occurred on neither of those reports, because they were looking at things in a very myopic way. They were not really looking at the organizational issues involved. So that's why this method, we think, really provides whole new insights into understanding. Sorry, are you doing? Oh, fine. Last topic. How many of you have ever heard of a thing called bug bounty programs? Okay, a handful, okay? So now, I don't know if you remember back in the old days, they used to have in the sheriff's office, wanted, dead or alive, Billy the Kid and whatever it might be. So the idea is rewards. Now, typically what these bug bounty programs are is if you were to discover a possible flaw in Microsoft Windows or Facebook or some system and report it to that company, they would say thank you, and besides thank you, they give you a nice little check. You will. This typically started off primarily in kind of what I'll call the basic services, the operating system companies and things like Facebook and so on. But now many others. United Airlines started it last year. It's interesting. The reward they give you is in miles. So someone got 1 million miles reward for finding a flaw in the program. But in any case, these are increasing. There's a company called HackerOne. If you don't want to have to run these things, they go and they recruit people for you. They do the bug findings, evaluations, payment. So you can do it yourself. Something I didn't realize until about 5 months ago, MIT had a bug bounty program. And actually, one of my students was one of the winners in it. I forgot what the bug was he found and if they fixed it or not yet. But in any case, so the reason I mention this is one of the fascinating issues going on, and once again, nobody really knows how to measure these things, but there are a number of reports that indicate that the shortage of cybersecurity workers, broadly defined, is estimated to be close to 2 million by 2020, within the next few years. Now, how they forecast, I don't know. The trouble is that there's just, and particularly, you always want to hire someone with 20 years of experience, of course, which you have to somehow manufacture in the next 2 years. Now, of course, if you're a good hacker, you'd find a way to get your CVs all updated appropriately. That's a good test to see how good you really are. So the problem is, how do you deal with it? So you have to be resourceful. So we look at ways, how do companies build up their cyber workforce? How do you get the regular workers, the non-quote cyber specialists, to be helpful? Because in many ways, you could probably equivalent to several millions of man hours or effort can be done by getting more people involved. So okay, so we're looking at these different kinds of innovative ways to deal with it, including bug bounty programs, if you will. So one of the ones that we found as a fascinating example, so keep this as a kind of a frame of mind, the Pentagon, which by the way has been hacked into a number of times, had set up a bug bounty program. Now, previously, they had hired an outside firm, possibly one of the consulting firms one of you may have, for over 3 years, paid them $5 million to check out their systems, and in the process, they found 10 vulnerabilities. About a year and a half ago, I think it was now, they launched the Hack the Pentagon program, a bug bounty program. It wasn't open to the world at large. They worked through HackerOne. They identified 1,400 what they call ethical hackers. You could call that a contradiction in terms, I suppose. I don't know. So these are the white hat hackers. Then there are black hat hackers, and then of course there's a few gray hats out there as well. And the idea was they recruited 1,400 and say, you know, you've done other programs for United Airlines, for Microsoft, and so on. We would like you to go and see what you can find in our system. You don't get paid a penny unless you find something. So there's some cost, if you will, to the Pentagon. And in the process, 250 of them found, oops, here, go back here. I found something. 138 of them were considered to be serious things. So here's the question. If you had a choice between taking 3 years, spending $5 million to find 10 vulnerabilities, or 6 months to find 138 for 150,000, I'll let you do the math. Now, I'm not trying to say that consulting firms are useless. I'm just trying to say that our alumni, very important. But I just want you to get you a sense, though, that we need to be creative and find new and better ways to do things. So, good news, 5-minute warning, and I've got 1 minute to go. And then we have 4 minutes or so for conversation. So I've tried to hopefully give you some sense that there are things being done, many of which being done here at the Sloan School and elsewhere, making things better. I hate to end on a not so good note, and that is my view, is that the worst is yet to come. And I'll give you one example of it. And this goes back actually a couple of years ago. This thing called the Internet of Things. So you're now having smart TVs, there's actually a smart refrigerator. The idea is you can be at the supermarket and you can see inside your refrigerator, oh yeah, it looks like I'm out of eggs, or it looks like the milk is very low. Well, there was an LG refrigerator about 2 years ago, while popping out ice cubes, was sending out pornographic spam. I can just see the FBI breaking down your door and seizing your refrigerator. Okay. So you know, my wife didn't realize it when she bought it, because the dentist recommended she got a brand new electric toothbrush with Wi-Fi enablement on it. So it's mostly intended for kids, teenagers, and so on. So it actually will keep track of how long and how good a job they did, and actually report it back to your iPhone and so on, telling you how they're doing. So you know, it is fascinating. It is fascinating, but the terrible things that can happen go on and on and on. So there's more and more attack surfaces, but you can be better prepared for others. Management needs to take the lead. So thank you very much. Oh, and just last thing, if you're interested, we have our website, lots more stuff on our website. Question, please. Thank you.
Just a comment or two about the role of open source in security?
Well, repeat the question, I'll do it open source. So let me ask you your impression first.
Upstream community, software. software for security applications, good news, bad news?
So the issue with open source in general is that the source code, the code of the system is available. So much like our comment regarding hackers makes it even easier because you actually can look inside the system. And there's a famous saying that with a million eyes, all bugs will be found, something like that. I guess my feeling is that I think it is one of many things you can do. I don't think it's a panacea. It doesn't, the fascinating thing on the Wall Street Journal article, they took something I said and they made it on their image of it. I say that you can put a stronger lock on your door, but if you're still putting the key under the mat, are you any more secure? So open source is one of many things you can do. It only solves a small part of the problems. And in fact, it actually opens up other problems because it also means the hackers can look at the code and see if they can find bugs faster than other people can. So it's a worthwhile thing to explore. Over there, I think. Oh, yes, microphone.
You gave the example of TJX and some of the failings in that process. But earlier in your presentation, you showed a graph of basically the hackers are moving faster than the intelligence in cybersecurity. So how does a CEO, CIO, CFO make the decision about when enough is enough in terms of their investment in cybersecurity?
First, you do make sure you keep your resume up to date. That's the first thing you should do as a CIO. In fact, to be honest with you, that's one of the research topics we're working on. That is how much should you spend on cybersecurity? So we don't have a quick answer. We have some anecdotal data so far, and that's one of the projects we're working on this year. So I could ramble more on it, but I think a year from now I'll be able to be much more concise. What we're trying to do now is come up with a prioritization. Let me tell you the problem you have. I don't know how many of you, probably all of you have had a class in probability. And every top executive, a board of directors, or a CEO will ask the CIO, what is our risk? They say, oh, it's easy. What you do is you take the probability of attack times the impact of the attack, and that tells you it. The only problem is we don't know how to get either of those two numbers. Because the attack you're going to have next week is probably an attack that's never happened before. So you don't have 100 years, like hurricanes, you don't have 100 years of data to go by. And the probability of it happening is because what happens, I got to tell you a quick story. There was this interesting flip back and forth. We actually are monitoring the dark web quite actively, it turns out. And we're looking at ransomware. There was actually a quick drop-off in ransomware for a period of time because the same technologies, we have a project called Cybercrime as a Service. It's a fascinating, basically how you cobble together a cyber criminal business, if you will. I won't talk about the ethics class I give at Sloan in terms, but it is a 1,500% return on investment, so think about that. But in any case, what was fascinating, with a slight twist in the way in which you do the cybercrime, they converted it from ransomware attacks to crypto mining attacks. So rather than locking up your computer, unbeknownst to you, your computer's cranking away, banking out Bitcoins. And so as the cost of Bitcoin goes up and down, the cyber attackers move around. So that's why you say, unlike a hurricane doesn't change direction just because you know it's coming. Cyber criminals are amazingly adaptive. So you don't know, what's going to happen. You don't know what the magnitude hack take. So the classic approach you take don't work. Well, we do think we come up with approaches that are not perfect, but to help you prioritize what projects are most pay off. I was told one last question. Who wants to be? Yes, right here, I think.
So
okay.
stay away from who and where. Do you have a chart of where they're located? I mean, is it
Cyber criminals?
North Korea and Russia, like we hear?
Whoa, that's a powerful, good question. Everywhere is probably the simplest way of phrasing it. It turns out that a lot of what I'll call semi-developed countries like Romania, not trying to pick on Romania, but a lot of countries where tech workers are not paid very well. This is not a bad, it's one thing to get, $1,500 with a ransomware attack in the United States. That could be a year's pay in some countries. So there's lots of places it occurs in the US. One of the things that's made, and North Korea has really complicated things. People used to separate out kind of state-sponsored, attacks and so on, and then kind of criminal attacks. North Korea needs cash. And they've got a tremendously well-trained cybersecurity force. They have a university top-notch, from what I can tell. It's hard to know much about North Korea, but what doesn't leak out, it's top-notch university creating cyber specialists. So this way you kind of combine the state-sponsored aspect with generating more cash. Rumor is they were behind the attack on the Bank of Bangladesh and SWIFT network, but that's only a rumor. I haven't talked to the Prime Minister yet. Okay, thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer questions afterward, and I encourage you to go to our website.